Okay, so before we actually get into the discussion of the structures within the central nervous system, let's first talk about how the neurons are going to organize themselves so that we can actually have a systems. And I say systems because we have more than just one system here. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the organization of the neural circuits and how those circuits lead to the networks that we talk about. So the first thing we have, the first thing we have to look at is what's referred to as the neural circuits, and we basically have four distinct pathways. The first two are seen here. The first one is referred to as the divergent pathway, where what ends up happening is we have a single input synapsing onto interneurons, and those interneurons will then synapse onto other interneurons. Each sequence along the pathway, what ends up happening is we split the signal. And so what ends up happening is we have multiple signals coming out of a single input. On the opposite end of this, we have the convergent pathway. In the convergent pathway, we're having multiple input signals that are all going to be synapsing onto a single output signal. This convergent signal is kind of like the image that we saw when we looked at the Hebbian synapse, when we looked at what happens when the synapse gets used more. So what ends up happening is that we usually have convergent and divergent networks functioning together, so that what ends up happening is that one convergent network will usually lead to a divergent network exiting out of it, and a divergent network will lead back to a convergent network within the pathways of the central nervous system. The other pathways that we look at here in terms of the network circuitry is what's referred to as the reverberating pathway and the parallel pathways. Now, what the reverberating pathway does is it sets up a feedback loop within the nervous system. This reverberating pathway is an attempt to ensure that the pathway that we want is the correct pathway. So we talked about why do we have a synapse, and one of the reasons why we have a synapse is because we want to make sure that the information going out is the correct information. What the reverberating pathway does is it ensures that what signal we're sending to do some sort of motor response, some efferent pathway, is the correct efferent pathway. So what ends up happening is you see that output neuron, the one in red. What it's doing is it's going to synapse back on a interneuron that's going to synapse back onto the neurons that came before it. If the signal is not going at the correct speed, what's going to happen is that signal is going to get blocked. If the signal is going at the correct speed, which means that we have the right output to come out, there is no interference within the signal. This way we can make sure that the signal that we want is the correct signal. On the other side, we have the parallel pathways. Now what ends up in the parallel pathway is we diverge off a signal, but all of the signals are going to come back to that same output. What we see with the parallel pathway is a multitude of ways to get to the same output. When things are of great importance, we have parallelity within the pathway. What this parallelity ensures is that the signal that we want to get out will get out. So if any of the pathways get blocked, hopefully one of the pathways will still work. So in this case here we have three pathways. So as long as one of the three pathways is functional, the pathway will go ahead and allow for function to take place. Within the nervous system, we basically organize ourselves out into 5 distinct systems. And you have to do this as a systems because it's multiple systems being put together into the nervous system, as we talk about in terms of singularity. The systems that we look at get broken up into 2 primary systems. The central nervous system, which is the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system. And the peripheral nervous system is basically any nerve and neuron that is not found within the central nervous system. This peripheral nervous system then gets subdivided out, in which we have what's referred to as the somatic nervous system. The somatic nervous system gets divided into the afferent pathways. That's going to be the pathways that bring sensory information from the periphery back to the central nervous system. And then the efferent pathway. The efferent pathway is what's going to allow for things like glandular secretions and motor functions to take place, primarily motor functions on the somatic nervous system pathway. Another pathway we have within the peripheral nervous system is the autonomic nervous pathway. The autonomic nervous pathway is responsible for immediate homeostatic regulation. In this, we have two distinct pathways of activation. One's referred to as the sympathetic pathway, the other one's referred to as the parasympathetic pathway. But what each of these pathways are doing is allowing for reflexive behavior. These are behaviors that we cannot control. We are unable to control the autonomic nervous system. Now, the central nervous system and Hey Dummy will send signals to regulate the autonomic nervous system, but it can't do anything beyond that. It can't tell the autonomic nervous system that, hey, I want this specific gland to fire, or I want this muscle to contract. That's not what the autonomic nervous system is going to do. It's simply going to be doing unregulated, unconscious behaviors. The last system that we have within the peripheral nervous system is the enteric nervous system. The enteric nervous system is responsible for regulation of the viscera, the organs. We usually talk about the enteric nervous system when we look at gastrointestinal functions, because this is the system that is going to be regulating the rate at which materials move through the alimentary canal, but it's also going to be involved with the sensing of all of the chemicals that we're eating so that we can know what hormones to produce and so that we know what fuel sources we'll have available once the meal has been done being consumed, digested, and absorbed. So if we look at a general schematic of how everything lays out, so the central nervous system is the cerebral cortex. Within the cerebral cortex, we have the 5 brains that we talked about at the end of last week, in which we have the forebrain. The forebrain is made up of those first 2 brains, the proencephalon and the telencephalon. And so what we're really talking about is we're talking about the lobular region, the lobes of the brain, which include things like the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, and the occipital lobe. But then we also have structures that are going to be deep to those cortical regions, such as the midbrain structures and the hindbrain structures. Now, if you notice, we have arrows that are going in both directions throughout all of these regions. That simply is an indication that we have crosstalk, which means that what's happening in the forebrain will also happen in the hindbrain and the midbrain. What happens in the hindbrain and the midbrain will also happen in the forebrain. All of those are going to send signals down to the spinal cord. The spinal cord will simultaneously be sending signals back to each one of those regions. Stemming from the spinal cord, we get the peripheral nervous systems. We get the autonomic branches, which include the parasympathetic and the sympathetic pathway. We get the enteric pathway. We get the somatic sensory pathway, which is feeding back into the central nervous system. We're heading towards the central nervous system. And then we get the somatic motor, or the efferent pathway, which is heading out away from the central nervous system. If we look at this pathway in terms of a reflex arc, what we end up getting something that looks like this, where we get a stimulus at the receptor, which is going to stimulate the afferent pathway. This afferent pathway is going to head through the dorsal root ganglion and then into an interneuron. Within the central nervous system, this interneuron can go ahead and go up the spinal cord into the cerebral cortex. At the same time, it can go ahead and it can synapse immediately with a lower motor neuron, which will then head down the efferent pathway through the ventral and lateral horns out to cause a response, whatever response we need in order to alleviate that stimulus. At the same time, the cerebral cortex, through the various cortical regions, are going to be sending signals down the spinal cord we refer to as the descending pathways, which will also synapse on the lower motor neurons and allow us to have a cognitive response to whatever that stimulus happens to be. So let's take a look at how we're able to process out the stimulus. So we start with the stimulus. The stimulus is going to lead to reception. This reception is based off of depolarization of the receptor, which is going to be based off of what type of stimulus we're dealing with, which we call energy and modality dependence, and where within both the body as well as where within the receptor this stimulus happens to be, what we call topographic dependency. The reception is then going to lead to depolarization of the sensory afferent. Now notice all of this is in green. What this green is this is an indication of a pathway that can be desensitized. That is, we stop having the ability to sense the stimulus if there's too much stimulus there at any point of time. We then start getting integration within the cerebrocortical structures, within the limbic system, within the thalamus, within the hippocampus, within the general integratory area, which we call the GIA, and then out into the primary cortices. This integration leads to perception within the limbic system, the hippocampus, and then ultimately into the frontal lobe. This will then lead to our cognitive awareness. And the cognitive awareness is going to be involved with the limbic system, the reticular activating system, the frontal lobe, and the prefrontal cortex within the frontal lobe. Now this pathway here, notice, is in red, and this is the indication of the attenuation pathway. This is where if we get the same stimulus over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, we stop paying attention to it because we're looking for the new novel stimulus. We're looking for the stimulus that's going to entertain us. If we do not get to that cognitive awareness, we do not have full perception, which means we will not remember the stimulus that we interact with. If we don't remember the stimulus we interact with, this is where that, as we talked about the first time we looked at the nervous system, where that sense of deja vu can come from.